The life of a brain-injured person relies heavily on structure and routines. And when a disruptor comes along, such as a pandemic, those routines can be very hard to replicate and support. Emotional well-being is an important part of all our lives. Trying to support people with brain injury throughout a pandemic and maintain their emotional well-being has been extremely challenging. The sense of isolation has gripped the whole world. Those with a brain injury were isolated before the pandemic. Trying to help them feel that they are included and supported is not always easy, but hopefully we'll show that there are some ways of doing that, and maybe some ways that everyone could replicate. The experts we spoke to all have considerable knowledge in dealing with those with a brain injury, and hopefully you'll see that there are a few positives that those experts can bring. The new regime that we all found ourselves in following the pandemic meant that we had to adhere to government guidelines, restrictions and advice. For someone with a brain injury, understanding that is not easy.
I think that lockdown has affected those with a brain injury in a variety of ways. I think it's been a huge thing to comprehend, to assimilate, to try and understand, huge change in structures to routines. Obviously, people have had to stay at home where they would normally maybe go out and access services or meet up with others. And I think it's had a very far-reaching effect on those with brain injury.
Lack of stimulation and boredom was something many of our clients really struggled with, especially those who suddenly had a disruption to their normal routines or could no longer access meaningful activities.
We had more critical incidents with clients, probably in that 12 months, than most of my 30-year career before in case management, either because of the anxiety, because of the lockdown, because of restrictions, because of change. I've got real concern about some people who, in fact, have lost rehabilitation gains because they suddenly went way back, without being able to go out.
Trying to support a family member with a brain injury throughout that time has been extremely stressful. Rehab is always challenging. It's difficult to go through any rehabilitation process and not struggle. But throw in the effects of COVID and the stresses and challenges that brings has made life extra difficult for everybody.
Lockdown has put a huge strain on families and carers of those with a brain injury because they've had to absorb roles that others were fulfilling, maybe care teams were fulfilling, or treating professionals who've been unable to visit in person.
The few resources that were available for families pre-pandemic were just not there. So, lots of services within the hospital were removed and people were redeployed. Lots of the outpatient services were just stopped. And as the world was told to stay at home, that meant the services the few services that are there for people just weren't available. And I can't imagine what that was like, having to deal with that kind of double isolation, I guess.
They not only had to carry the additional anxieties and worries of how their brain injured loved one would be affected, but also face their own increased risks to things like care burnout through social isolation and reduced support access.
With all the reassurance, doing films, reassuring the families that it was okay to have support when they could, but even so, there are a number of families that decided not to, and they found that very hard. They found it the restrictions because they might have been able to do more, but if they were with someone that was being shielded. We have problems with family members really getting to the end of their tether.
Probably merged families and carers a lot together because they've had to share the burden, really, where the person's life has been very much reduced in the, where they can go, who they can see safely, what they can do.
Things had to change after the pandemic. Things had to move online, and the challenges that presented to the therapists and people with a brain injury were immense.
Sort of during the first lockdown, particularly when meeting face-to-face was not possible, we worked hard as an organisation to provide some varied digital solutions to continue supporting our clients with brain injury. And this included live online sessions, but also kind of pre-recorded videos that targeted specific rehab goals. And then additionally, sort of demonstration videos of ideas and approaches that family members and or carers could support with in person.
If you've got someone profoundly physically disabled who's in the early stages of rehab, something like Zoom is quite difficult to come to grips with. I mean, we did find that we used a lot of technology. What we would have done without Zoom, I don't know. With introducing psychology, doing assessments, we took on clients with all sorts of difficulties that we had to try and assess on Zoom. It's very hard because someone with communication difficulties just finds it very hard to be able to get that same level of stimulation on a Zoom that they would on a personal.
People are perhaps more adaptable than they thought they were. We've moved to a virtual world which didn't exist for many people before the pandemic. There have been opportunities to connect with other people that you wouldn't otherwise have connected with, and those opportunities have extended to those with a brain injury as well as the rest of the population.
I think the feedback that we got from a lot of our clients that did surprise us was how much they did enjoy kind of having those weekly things something to look forward to in the week, something that brought structure, and even working together to be flexible about finding creative solutions of how we could continue to work on some of our kind of rehab goals together.
And quite often the anxiety around they won't cope with a long session on Zoom, the anxiety around that is worse than the reality. I wonder if the way people have had to adapt. I don't think it's been either or. I think some people have found it very isolating. The families have found it very isolating. However, I think on the other hand, other people have found that being able to stay in contact via technology or meet people who are maybe further away geographically that they wouldn't have had the chance to meet.
I think the important thing now is really to look at what we've done through the pandemic and think about what models of service provision we want to keep moving forward and which ones we want to return to. I think personally, lockdown gave me an opportunity to think about support for families following brain injury and allowed me to establish a special interest group, and this is called Anchor Point. That the first idea for this was explored with Headway Derby, and just from conversations that we were having about the huge gap in service provision of support for families, I think talking with other really passionate people, we now have, very proud to say, we now have 18 members of a steering committee, and we're supported by a number of organisations, including the universities of both Derby and Plymouth, Headway Derby, Headway UK, UKBIF, Head First, the Child Brain Injury Trust, and also, of course, Royds Withy King. I think what's key about this group is our ambition to make a real difference, and including in that things like signposting to services, identifying research priorities, connecting people, sharing stories, and really lobbying for change at a national level.
The pandemic brought with it a sense of isolation, something that we all had to find ways to try and deal with and cope as best we can. Imagine the world of a brain injured person, because that world was isolated before the pandemic. We all experienced to some degree the world that a brain injured person inhabited.
One of the very interesting points that someone made to me at the beginning was, welcome to my world when we got locked down, i.e. someone with a brain injury whose whole life had been derailed, suddenly saw that we'd all been derailed together.
At Royds Withy King, we have a lot of experience of working with brain injured people and their families. This will come together later this year in our Ahead Together conference, where the theme of the conference is the family identity and maintaining that.
It's a really unique conference on the calendar, really aiming at bringing people together, professionals together who are deeply passionate about improving the way that they support families following brain injury. There is that really strong presence of experts by experience, people who have navigated the system, who have their own journeys and their own experiences to tell professionals what they need to know to actually support families.